Welcome to another show, the Research to Reps Roundtable. I am your co-host, Dr. Coach Pat Ivey. We are excited. Another show here. Dr. Ted, I know you've been busy, but how are you doing?
I'm doing outstanding and looking forward to our discussion with Felix today.
This is going to be exciting. Dr. Ernie Reimer, what's going on?
Not much, man. Just really happy to be on the show. And we have a special guest today. This is Felix Proessl. I first it was introduced to Felix when he was working at Pitt and getting his PhD, but he has since finished that. And now he's moved on to work with the Colorado Rapids. How are you doing today, Felix?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and yeah, talk some shop with you all.
Awesome, Felix. I know Ernie's ready to jump right into it, but first, warm our audience up just a little bit on who you are and why you think you're a guest on this podcast.
Well, I'll leave you to decide why I'm worthy of being on this podcast, but I appreciate all having me. So yeah, a little bit of background about myself. As you might hear based on my voice and my accent, I'm not from the US. I was born and raised in Germany. Um, did all my schooling there, high school, but then decided to come to the US to play collegiate soccer. And spent 4 years in a small school in Nebraska in Hastings College. Um, got really interested in sort of, the scientific backbone of why I do what I do as an athlete. Developed an interest for that and decided to continue the research route post my undergrad. Went to Colorado State for my master's and really dove heavy into research there. Um, Spent my main focus on the brain and the central nervous system as it relates to fatigue and sports and exercise science. And, learned a lot and really wanted to continue doing that. I also realized that research sometimes can be quite far removed from the actual applied side. So I always wanted to continue working with teams, and I did that at Colorado State with the women's soccer team, but I had a really great opportunity at the University of Pittsburgh to work with the men's soccer team there while doing and continuing this line of research in human performance and with a neuroscientific emphasis. So I went there, had a great time there, learned a lot both in the lab and on the field. And after that, when I wrapped it up, became the director of sports science for the whole university. Worked with a lot of great people there. Tried to implement the same model we had developed within the soccer team across other teams. And then, yeah, as Ernie alluded to, a couple years later, last April and 24, I decided to come back to Colorado. And I'm in my second year now with the Colorado Rapids as Senior Director of Sport and Data Science. So I guess to come back to your question, I feel like I've had a background both in the laboratory-based research and in the applied side. So maybe that's one of the reasons I'm here today. But yeah, like I said, excited to dive into that today with you all.
Well, thanks a
Felix, go ahead, Ernie.
lot. Yeah. Well, I'd be curious because if I'm not mistaken, you all are just about to embark on your 2025 campaign, and I'd be curious to know what's at the top of the minds of yourself and your coaching staff there as you embark upon your preseason training and going into a new season.
Yeah. So, Colorado, blessing and a curse at the same time. We are at altitude. As every other team, we want to prepare for the season ahead. But that altitude certainly provides a couple environmental challenges because if you saw the temperature in Denver today, you don't want to be outside. Yet football and soccer is an outdoor sport. So we need to be somewhat at altitude for our training so that we don't get altitude exposure at the beginning of the season, but we're acclimated by the time the season starts. So we're actually in preseason right now in Mexico at altitude, and that way we can kind of combine both worlds, the environmental piece of altitude and the temperatures to be outside. Obviously, we just want to prepare all our athletes for both the physical and tactical demands that are coming up here soon. And so the biggest piece for all of us is just, yeah, fostering collaboration and making sure we're touching each area significantly throughout that process, so that, yeah, by the time February 18th will roll around, which is our first game of the season, we're ready to go. So I know in college it's sometimes a bit different. You sometimes work with shorter time frames, but it's been really fortunate to have at least like a 6, 7 week time span to prepare for the year ahead.
I was going to, Felix, what questions, how would you answer the questions Felix, the collegiate soccer player, had when you were, an undergrad playing, collegiate soccer? The questions that you had, how would you answer those now that, you've embarked on a very distinguished career with regard to your academic advancements?
Yeah, some of the questions, in the collegiate space, they're very fast paced and shorter lived questions, I would say, that affect sort of, the acute state of the athlete, more so than any larger, 10,000 foot overview questions, seasonal questions, longitudinal questions. I think a lot of the questions that we've had initially were all centered around the immediate well-being and care of the athlete, and I think, we of course still address those questions nowadays and continue to address them at Pitt. But I think the thing that changed as part of sort of my academic development and experience in the field as well was that while those questions were being addressed, and the need of the athlete was met, we acquired an appetite also for larger big picture questions that sort of develop as part of doing the day-to-day well and consistently well over months and years, such that, not just one team does a certain regiment of data collection, but multiple teams do it. If multiple college teams go through the same semester and sort of the same annual variability with exams and things that they have a similarity, then there are some big picture overarching questions across all student athletes. And similarly now, in the professional space, there are times where the season is more demanding and less demanding, not just on the field, but off the field. So being able to see both sides, the acute and the sort of chronic need for some of these questions, I think that's something that kind of arose throughout time in athletics. I imagine, Ernie, you probably had a similar experience. I know both at Utah and then at Louisville. I'd be curious to hear how your progression was in that space.
Yeah, for sure. It probably almost the opposite of what you described. I would say, for me, often I've looked at the team in the sport program as the organism, and then we start to we plan to help the team be successful. Then we kind of drill down to the individual from there. Kind of like taking an approach where if we implement really good plans and strategies for the team, then we're going to take care of most. And it helps us be more efficient in getting down to the individual athlete need. So then definitely in the environment I'm in now, I would say that we are often very, very concerned with what's happening with each of the parts of the team, being each individual athlete. And we definitely spend a lot less time on looking at the whole plan. What things can we put in place that are going to take care of the masses, and then how do we solve problems for the unique few that might have some special concerns. And I would be interested to throw this over to Ted. I know that you do a lot of consulting, interact with a lot of sports programs, Ted. How do those different programs that you interact with kind of approach their plans from the team standpoint down to the individual athlete?
I think the biggest thing in terms of the role I play with a lot of the teams is fostering collaboration amongst, the group of, the sports medicine and sports performance, as well as the coaching. So everybody's on the same page as alignment. So if you have ideas as a sports scientist and not everybody's aligned, you're just, preaching to the choir. So I think the biggest thing is getting everybody aligned. And so any plan that you want to implement, everybody's on the same page. And why that sounds simple, I find it difficult in some instances to get everybody on the same page. How about you, Felix? Have you found that you've gotten everybody in alignment there in Colorado?
Yeah, I would agree with what you said, Ted, in the sense that it's of utmost importance really to have that in line, and I think we're on a good path towards that. The way I always kind of echoed what you said to students at Pitt or up and coming people in the field is that we do so much background work as a sports scientist to inform one decision, but none of this stuff actually does anything if the people that then quote unquote actually make the decision aren't really tied into what you are doing, right? And if there's no collaboration with those people. And so at the end of the day, that's why I think this is all still, data informed and not data driven decision making. The kind of the road all leads to this roundtable conversation with coaches where, you still need to have this human element and be able to relate to their needs and problems, address those questions through a scientific lens, and then hopefully through that process inform the next best step. So knowing also and acknowledging that your approach has limitations as well, that you might not consider all data sources that are relevant for this problem. I know at Louisville, you all have a really great emphasis on the mental side, for instance. From a data perspective, that is not always as easy to capture, right? So you might be able to have GPS, physical data, strength measures and other readiness testing, subjective well-being scores that might be indicative of some things that you see in the data and that you bring forth to some of these conversations. But, acknowledging that there are other emotional or mental aspects that you might not be capturing, but that can come forth in conversations like that, I think is important to foster that collaboration, because it's also easy for other people in the room to perceive a sports scientist as the person that, just wants to lead the way and dictate decision making, etc. And I think that's a very slippery slope. So Dr. Ivey, I'd be curious to hear from you how you all approach that subject at Louisville.
With different coaches, they have different experiences. The Olympic sport coaches tend to have a better understanding of the holistic process as it relates to high performance, or bringing all of these areas together, and then how to issue a challenge or a question to the health and performance team, and then expecting an answer back that they can use to inform their decision making. As it relates to more of the bigger your basketballs and your footballs, you have coaches that have really perfected the art of coaching. And the science is something that's relatively new, although what they do is very scientific, but putting it in the framework of science is something that they have not really practiced that much. So approaching it from that standpoint, I think that they immediately sometimes put up, barriers in terms of what your access might be, the conversations, the influence you can have. And I think we need to focus more on what they're really good at, and that's building relationships. Our coaches are really good at building relationships. They're good at the art of coaching. And how do we, knowing the science, know where we want to get to, how do we meet them where they're at, and then eventually get them on board through education and relationship, where they start to ask the question like, You know, I wonder if we can practice, if we moved our practice schedule around, would we get better outcomes? Who should I talk to? Oh, my sports scientist. Like, we can get there, but it takes more work with some coaches than others. And I think sometimes we like to generalize. We like to say, all right, when we're talking to head coaches, this is the message. And that just doesn't work. There's too many different experiences, too many different personalities, different expectations. And I think if we can learn to individualize our approaches with our head coaches and sports teams, the way we say we design training programs, then I think we can have more success and quicker buy-in, if that makes sense. Ernie, is that accurately describe maybe the experiences you have?
I'd say so. The very interesting and challenging part about collegiate athletics is that you're where I mentioned earlier that one sport program that is the organism. Well, think of it like each sport is its own species, and they have their own experiences and their own arts of coaching, and they some have valued scientific insight and inquiry and data informed decision making, whereas others have used it as their style is more of an art form. And so you have different personalities, different cultures, and different approaches with every one of those sports. And it takes a lot of very careful navigation to try to be a chameleon to what's happening in that sport and try to build those relationships and to ask questions, to answer questions, and then grow the value that you might be able to provide to those sports. And it's an ever-going cycle because in the collegiate athletic setting, if you hire a new head coach and you get kind of an entire new coaching staff and team, sometimes you have to, no matter how far you were with maybe a previous coaching staff, a lot of times you almost have to start all over with the new one. And maybe in a year's time you are further, or you haven't really gotten started yet. So I would say, without question, Dr. Ivey, yes, I would agree. And just to maybe throw this over to Felix, you were hired by Colorado to come into your role. Would you maybe reflect on an experience maybe you've had over the past year, sharing what you're allowed to share, where maybe you've faced a unique challenge and where you were able to bring some insight to the table that helped you make a breakthrough for the sports science department?
Are you referring more so to relationships with coaches or just involvement in general?
Yeah. So I guess to clarify my question a little bit, a lot of times what I found in sports science is that you're building those relationships, but when there is a question, when they do inquire with sports science and you're able to deliver to help inform them, a lot of times that goes a long way to furthering that relationship, but also helping others build trust in what sports science has to offer. So to thank you for asking for that clarification and to go back to the question, can you think of an experience that you can share with us where you're a new staff member, you probably still feel pretty new being in your second year, and there was a unique challenge you all face, and you were able to help navigate that using your practices?
Yeah. So I would say one area where, contrary to the collegiate space and my upbringings in Europe as well, the Major League Soccer is extremely um, aggressive in it is travel. So, the league is set up in the Western and Eastern Conference, but there are a handful of crossover games where some of the Western Conference teams play the Eastern and vice versa, which means, really being in mountain time at Colorado, we play literally in all time zones in the US. So we have some games in Eastern time, some in Central, Mountain, and then Western. The travel time itself is pretty extensive. So last year we had a scenario where we played a game in LA and then flew to Philly for the next game. So you literally fly across the country, across 3 time zones. So the sort of the travel related environmental challenges are really difficult. Oftentimes we have mid-week games, as is common in college, but the difficult piece is that they're associated with a 4-hour flight all of a sudden, and time zone changes and things like that. So one of the questions we had is, okay, how do we better navigate our travel schedule? And so we utilized aura data to essentially look into recovery timeframes, post travel into each respective time zone to get us a better idea of what does that actually look like on an individual basis. Compared that as a control group with home games, essentially, because we know even with home games that all MLS games start at 7:30 p.m. Athletes typically don't like or have a hard time falling asleep post game because they're amped up from the game. It's difficult to wind down and actually fall asleep. So even at home games on match days, sleep isn't great. But that kind of guided our decision making to then decide, okay, are we flying back the same night of the game? Are we staying an extra night? When are we departing for the game? And things of that nature. Again, going back to that same, it's an art and a science at the same time. It was when we discussed kind of the results of the analysis and when we implemented these changes, it was not this is what we found, so we have to do it like this every single time, right? Sometimes we have a week in between games, and then it makes more sense to apply this rule based on the results that we found compared to midweek games and a turnaround of just 2 days. So, I guess that's ultimately where that art came back into place of acknowledging the value of that analysis and the value of that work, but at the same time addressing that there's a bigger picture. Players have families and things of that nature that we need to respect for their emotional well-being. So I would say that's been a good way in which we, I think, collaboratively found a common ground between, what probably helps us bring the program a little bit forward, but at the same time, coaches not feeling restricted in their point of view. So it's ultimately been, a great experience. And there's several others, but I think at the end of the day, it boils down to these conversations where you sit down and you try to understand where they come from, acknowledge that, empathize with that, and then ultimately find the middle ground between the two. So travel can be a big one in the MLS. I don't know what your experience with travel is in the collegiate space, but Ted, you've worked with a broad range of teams, across different sports. Some we know have even crazier schedule, right, with more games. Some have a more rhythmic week by week schedule. What is your experience like with that?
I think now with the NFL, playing internationally at a much more frequent than they have in the past. You have Brazil, Germany, Spain, England. So I think everybody's trying to figure out, what the ideal, when should we arrive? What's the best time to arrive? Should we use, some, light treatments to get our biorhythms or circadian rhythms in sync. So I think it's still a process. And I think some of the stuff that you do, the research might show some promise, but when you're talking to a player, I don't ever say it shows some promise. I would say with more conviction to say, yes, this should help you. Whether it helps you 5% or 90%, in the athlete's mind, you sort of want to, make them feel confident that the procedures that you're, implementing for the travel make the most sense. But another question I have for you is this: how do you deal with players and coaches that have certain superstitions that may not have a lot of, say, science behind them, but that coach or athlete has a lot of comfort following some of these methods?
Yeah, I think if the placebo effect is real, then I'd greatly take it, you know. I think the risk of removing that effect is larger than just letting them go about their business and keeping it. So we try to respect their traditions. I think for the first time in my career now, I'm also working with, a wide range of athlete ages with different years of experience in the field. So we have players that you now can draft players early as a sophomore in soccer. So, we have 19-year-olds running around, and you have people in their mid-30s who've played professionally for over a decade already and very high levels and, all over the world, in Europe, Asia. Everybody has kind of a different cultural background and experience. And so if my point of view is always, if they spend 10 years figuring out what works for them, and I know them 1 month, who am I to know better, right? So they clearly have taken their time to develop what they find works for them, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. Now, if I can help them along their way with that routine, to sprinkle some thoughts in, yeah, I think it's helpful to do that. But I think we have to be careful with removing things, particularly with the more nervous athletes among the team, because yeah, again, I think I gladly take the placebo effect, but yeah, ultimately the removal thereof can be pretty dangerous, I think. Um, Ernie, what does it look like in Louisville? I know you guys have a broad range of cultures there too, a lot of international players, particularly in the world of soccer. Some Scandinavian players in the past, I know that. What does it look like at the collegiate level for you there?
I mean, it looks like everything. I mean, um, it's probably even more complex than just having athletes from different countries, because now with like transfer portal and stuff, you could have complete facelifts as far as your rosters go from one year to the next. So you're constantly trying to keep up with the new personalities and stuff. But there was an interesting question that Ted asked that made me think of a question we were presented with over the last year, and this might resonate with your world a little bit, Felix, is because you're at altitude. The question that was presented to us was that the team was going to have a competition against an opponent at altitude, and so they're going to be traveling to a high altitude visiting um, venue, and the kind of the status quo or the superstition, I guess, would be that when you go to altitude, to instead of traveling, say, 2 days before the event, to travel one day before the event. And we were asked if they should travel one day before versus 2 days before. And so usually when posed with a question like that, where we don't have a lot of experience with the actual answer, we will go into the peer-reviewed literature. And what we, being Paul, our assistant sports scientist, and myself, what we found after reviewing the literature was that the literature did actually confirm that this was a common practice in elite soccer in particular, but there wasn't a lot of like scientific evidence to truly support the efficacy of it. Another thing that we discovered is that some would actually travel into a low altitude site, and then they would try to do a short flight, like a 1 or 2 hour flight to the high altitude site, even game day. And after doing our review, what we had discovered based on the evidence that we could get our hands on was that the longer you spend at high altitude, the more beneficial it is, down to the hours and days. And so in the end, we couldn't actually find any evidence to support traveling match day -1 instead of the usual 2. We couldn't find any evidence to support traveling to the high altitude venue same day. So in your experience and what you've encountered being in high altitude, and knowing that you went through a lot of travel, like what would your advice be, or how would you approach that problem?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. That's one that, we benefit from, that there doesn't seem to be a very black and white answer right now. But one that we're currently investigating with optical tracking data as well, because we're curious to see what the actual deficit is of teams playing on our side versus us playing them on their side, and knowing that there's a confounding home field advantage as well in the MLS. But I would say that the majority of teams, certainly that came to our place, arrived on match day -1 rather than -2. And I think that's ultimately where, you have your ideal scientific scenario, and then you have reality a lot of times where you might have a midweek game, which makes travel logistics sometimes difficult. Then you also have the next factor from an MLS perspective. Teams are required to give the other team access to facilities on match day -1, but not on -2. So you could, in theory, train and then travel. But if you wanted to train on site, you kind of hope that that other team is giving you permission to have facilities, or else, you're gotta play that game of finding a facility elsewhere, and then it prolongs that day. So ultimately, from a physiological perspective, I would say that majority of teams arrive at -1. For us, we try to acclimatize as long as possible. Hence, we made the decision to be at altitude for preseason as well. Because you can imagine if we were to spend preseason at sea level and then, got back to Denver the first week of season, the first couple of days of training intensity, we would have anticipated to be lower, internal demands yet being higher, and recovery as a consequence worse. So for us, we try to acclimatize as long as possible. And we try to spend, although that's sometimes difficult as well, as little time as possible at sea level. So we for instance, have a trip coming up where we play consecutive away games on the West Coast. So then the question is also, on the one hand, what we found traveling back from West Coast to the Mountain Time, we lose an hour flying back. So arrival time is even later, sleep is worse. But we have to simultaneously balance that with how much time are we willing to spend at sea level, to where we aren't getting concerned with basically losing some of our acclimatization that we accomplished at altitude. So it's an ever-evolving puzzle, I would say, and there's many factors. So kind of like going back to the point with coaches meetings, this is where we would bring the scientific evidence from a physiological perspective, what we observe in some of our data collected, but we also have to acknowledge that there's, equipment related logistical questions that are worthy of conversation, that confound with some of those ideas. And it's, ultimately, why this is all data informed, and why multiple people should all chime in on this. I don't know, Ted, what is it like when a team goes abroad? Because that's even further than, right? You brought up games in Germany. Sometimes that turnaround is just a week. So you have not only now we have an 8-hour time difference rather than just a 3-hour time difference. You might play Mexico City as well, which is at altitude, right? So how does it look like there?
A lot of times it's the teams will arrive earlier in the week just because of their media obligations. So it's not only a game situation, but it's also a PR event as well, to try to expand the popularity of American football abroad. So most teams will probably arrive like on a Tuesday for that next week's game, and because they just have other obligations, and they get used to the venue in which they'll be practicing or playing in on Sunday. And so sometimes it's not what is probably physiologically the best. A lot of it has to do with football as a business and you sort of understand where the league's coming from. And most of the time, when teams have a game abroad, usually they follow it up with a bye week. So when they come back, they usually have a week off, and in some situations.
So maybe a follow-up question there, because I'm really intrigued with us being in Mexico right now. We kind of spent a lot of time thinking about this, but if a team goes to a quite different culture, let's say to Germany, for instance, have you observed what they do from a nutrition perspective? Like, do they try to acknowledge the culture in some way, or is it more so
Well,
we know what works and we bring our people and we stick to what we know?
I think sometimes they do. I do know a couple of years ago they had issues in Mexico City. There was a player on the Houston Texans that tested positive for clenbuterol from a piece of meat that he ate. So, he was initially suspended, and then they did their due diligence, and he got the suspension, overturned. So I think there's times where it's a much more of a comprehensive approach in terms of the catering abroad. But I think they do try to, respect and the cultures of the different countries that they're playing in. Have you had any issues or concerns with the clenbuterol question?
Not so far, knock on wood.
Okay.
But it's certainly something that comes up a lot, right? You're thinking about the water, the tap water. You're thinking about all these kinds of things. What you're allowing athletes to do, how far they can kind of roam on their own. You want to give them freedom. You don't want them to feel like they're stuck, but yeah, at the same time, you can expose yourself to risk. So that's why that's such an intriguing question. There's so many facets that have more to do with sort of simple behavioral questions rather than very nuanced, fine detail questions. So, Dr. Ivey, were you going to chime in?
I love this conversation. For me, I always think about the psychology behind it. My first professional game, I played in the NFL. My first professional game was in Japan. Like, is that how you want to start your, as an undrafted free agent, trying to make a team, traveling to the other side of the world, learning a new defense, new teammates, new coaches, new environment, new league, new country, and the ketchup doesn't taste the same. It was quite an experience trying to adjust with the time zones, adjust to the cultures, adjust to the traffic, adjust to the humidity. The humidity was off the charts. So there's a lot, and you just have to be able to focus. You have to understand what's a distraction, what can you control, and how can you eliminate those distractions, and then just focus on what matters. And I think those athletes that can do that obviously have the better chance of having the type of performance they want. And the team of athletes that do that, my my thought goes to what can we do to better prepare athletes. But at the same time, we probably need to better prepare coaches. I'm sure their coaches were in the same boat. Like, we're going to Japan. What do we do? Passports, food, sleep. They're having their own adjustment issues as well. So it's not just the athletes. I think sometimes we need to look at a bigger picture and understand the impact of the decision makers that are also involved in this process. I do want to go in a different direction if you don't mind, because as I've looked at your background and the amazing work you did at University of Pittsburgh, the question I have revolves around student involvement. Not student athlete. It can be student athlete involvement, but student involvement. And it's really a three-part question. And if Dr. Reimer, if you could fill in afterwards, I'd love to hear what were your thoughts on it as well. But we know that for sports science to continue to grow, we have to have students be interested in sports science. And I think they are. But that has to continue, that has to grow. So when you think about student involvement in sports science, so three aspects: students, athletics department, and then campus or academia, however you want to say it. What do you think the roles are to continue this push for sports science as it relates to student, campus, and athletics when it comes to student involvement in sports science?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and something I think I probably enjoyed maybe even the most during my time in Pittsburgh is just fostering relationships with students, seeing where they are now, following that path, and sort of the practitioners they become. I was extremely fortunate that by the time I started as director of sports science, um, a lot of people had a pretty strong appetite to bridge academia and athletics already at Pitt. So that the lab I did my PhD in, for instance, already had done some of the work initially for some of the the bigger teams, at basketballs, etc., footballs, and luckily, Matt Darnell, an early person in the laboratory, was one of the first people to really push for the growth of the sports science master's program. Um, and multiple people that followed after. Stephanie, Mark, and I were lucky then to kind of continue this path and really implement them within the world of athletics. So every year, I would say there were about between 8 to 10 graduate students, all from different backgrounds. Some had a cycling background, others soccer, really all over the place, which was awesome because everybody had a different perspective on the same type of question. What makes an athlete a good athlete? How can we push the boundaries? What really matters? What is a distraction, to your point earlier? And getting to implement them within the respective Olympic teams or football and basketball was extremely rewarding. I think the biggest thing for them, and one thing I always try to encourage, is to not make it seem like sports science is a separate thing, like a new silo. I'd really try to push for them to just become an organic part of the team. Do that first and foremost, so that people aren't asking even the question, what should I do with this person? What is sports science? Because at the end of the day, I think we all acknowledged it in some way, some fashion earlier, that coaches may not be used to having data alongside their thinking, but a lot of times the thinking was already based on scientific principles, right? So it's not like we're implementing something completely new. We just need to kind of learn where their thoughts are, and the scientific principles that they prioritize, maybe, and then find a way to implement data within those means. So um, I think one of the most important steps for them to become really a part of the team was to just be that and not be too concerned about, oh, we need to now do counter movement jumps. Why? I don't know. We just need to do counter movement jumps, right? There's got to be a clear rationale for a question, given the types of problems that this program has. And I figured to me, the only way to really genuinely get at that was to understand the program in and of itself in the first place. And then I think the next part of that was students need to be curious. I think that's probably one of the best attributes a sports scientist can have. How you derive an answer, what type of you know data analysis method you use, if you're getting started in Excel, if you're getting using Tableau, if you are whatever, right? Like the scientific method needs to be in place, and that you have a question and you want to basically use data to test the hypothesis. And how you do that is up to you. But in order to get there, you need to be curious in the first place. And so I tried to encourage my students to never be afraid to just ask questions. Obviously, knowing the time and place when to ask that question or the point of contact that you should ask that question is valid and important, but never to be afraid to ask and then try to come up with a way to provide an answer to that question. I think that allowed a lot of them to become an organic part of it, of each program, and then ultimately, yeah, like I said earlier, seeing where their path developed from there was extremely important and super rewarding to me. Ernie, I know you have a lot of people at Louisville. I visited you plenty of times and learned a lot from you. So what was your method of madness there?
Honestly, just that madness. I mean, I have nothing but respect for the program at Pitt. One of the unique things that Pitt has that we don't have is that they have a master's degree program in sport science that is dedicated to developing sports scientists as professionals. And so a part of, it's really nice to have a scenario like that because those students and their required fieldwork experiences can marry up really well with athletics. Whereas at University of Louisville, we have a system like that, like in the strength conditioning master's program, where the strength conditioning coaches in our different sports can host those individuals as interns as part of their field work for their master's degree. But we don't have a program like that at U of L for sports scientists. And so it really has been madness, but a ton of fun at the same time. Um, we've had students come in who are coming from the business school, and getting a master's of science in business statistics or business analytics. We've had students come in who are coming from undergraduate and master's degree programs in our School of Engineering, as well as our Health and Sports Sciences program and others. So it's been very rewarding to constantly go out and network with the different faculty who would become advocates for their students finding their way into fieldwork experiences or other engaged learning experiences with our sports science department. Another thing that has been really critical to our success is that the experiences we can provide students are very customizable. So a lot of the times, we can take anyone, no matter what their background is and their availability, and find out what their interests are and what their skills and their underlying knowledge might be, and how we might be able to find a niche for them to provide value to our sports science department, health and performance, the sports, or the athletic department. Another really interesting thing that's been happening with us is that I didn't actually just realize this until just about a week ago, but we have actually started to facilitate sports science internships for our student athletes. So over the past year, we've had 7 different student athletes come in and do internships with us as part of their fulfilling their curriculum for their undergrad or graduate programs. And I think the way that we've been able to accomplish that is just by being flexible and being able to customize the experience to the different needs of the students. And so we've had to be very agile and flexible and adaptable. And that's the madness that has allowed us to find success with the internship program that we offer, which, by the way, has placed some individuals into some really good jobs.
I find that really interesting, Ernie, because I think one thing that I think we saw evolve at Pitt is the same thing, that student athletes all of a sudden became sports science master students, which was amazing because a lot of them already had sort of the intuitive thinking, asking the right questions. So now we just needed to provide them with a couple of skills and tools in order to answer questions. I always thought that it's also a really great opportunity for sort of the graduate assistant coach that is needing some degree, and sometimes that degree is just to fill a box in order to become a graduate assistant coach for a team. But what better way than to learn, at least a method of evaluation for your players. It doesn't need to be tied to groin squeezes and counter movement jumps, right? The questions are, endless, and they can be a lot more sport specific than that if necessary. So I think it provides a really cool platform, not just for student athletes or any student interested in sport, but particularly for those that really are, interested in coaching per se, because at the end of the day, that, I think that's what we all call ourselves, and if you were to talk to a third grader or so, we're basically coaches. How we're helping athletes differs in a number of ways, but our way might just be through the use of numbers and data. So I always thought that could be an intriguing way in the future as well.
Go
I was
ahead,
going
Ted.
to say, Felix, you said your specialty for your doctor was, central factors related to fatigue. And I think was it Newsom and Davis have done some research with regard to the central fatigue hypothesis. From your studies and research, what have you found to be most practical in terms of implementing that with your athletes?
Yeah, that is a very good question. So I think that was probably one of the most unique experiences about my PhD. In the laboratory, we did some really high-end laboratory-based work. One study in particular, we worked a lot with the Department of Defense. We had military soldiers come to the laboratory for 4 days straight, and they literally spent every single minute of their time in Pittsburgh with us in a variety of labs. They slept in our sleep lab. We had electroencephalography on them to monitor brain waves and basically REM sleep, non-REM sleep, durations. We tested their central nervous system through a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation every single day to just essentially look into the connection between cortical factors and muscular factors. We had biomarkers. Literally, it was probably one of the most extensive projects I've ever been a part of and seen. And importantly, from an experimental intervention, 2 nights, they only slept 4 hours. And so in order to mimic somewhat of a simulated military operational stress environment, so they only slept 4 hours, and those 4 hours were separated into two-hour blocks. In addition, on those days after they slept only for 4 hours, they were exposed to strenuous physical activity. They did their typical rock marches. We took them through a variety of physical tests that are kind of mimicking the typical soldier related tasks that they're expected to perform and perform well at. And they were only allowed to eat 50% of their caloric needs, which we assessed at the very first day through resting metabolic rate. So, they're sleep deprived, they're hungry. We put them through a bunch of exercise. It's a highly intense couple of days. What we found actually is that when we looked at to these central factors, that was actually not that big of a decline, at least within those 2 days, right? So if you extrapolate it out, it could be something completely different for more than 48 hours. There was still a decline in some of the physical parameters, but we essentially saw two types of groups emerge out of, I think it was an N of 60 or 70 approximately. Those that basically were more exposed to physical exercise in the first place, or quote unquote fitter than the opponents with better body comp, higher VO2 max, etc. They not only outperformed the other group in the beginning, but they were also to maintain their central factors to a greater extent during those times compared to their counterparts that were worse to begin with, but then with that given intervention that was the same across two groups also declined more. So those overlap with a more and less resilient group that overlap with differences in deep sleep latencies across the day. So it was very interesting to just see that, but I guess the take-home message from that was that, yes, there are some protective mechanisms. Ironically, I don't think that our high-end measures, so the transcranial magnetic stimulation and the electroencephalography, were actually the most meaningful measures. I think some of the behavioral outcomes were more meaningful. So the endpoints, and I think that's a big lesson for sports science in general, is that sometimes it's difficult, right? If you talk about central factors, you would really want to know what's going on inside of the brain, but it's not really realistic to perform MRIs in an applied environment, right? So what do? What's the next best proxy? Well, sleep measures, which are now more accessible with Aura, Whoop, etc., and wearables, those can be somewhat indicative of that. We do take labs here now and blood work with the Colorado Rapids, not as frequently as we would need in order to address that question, but you can be smart about how you structure those. But those endpoints are ultimately what you are more worried about. You're worried about their performance, not their brain in that moment, right? Because as it was the case in these two groups, I can tell you that they were both fatigued, and ironically, or subjectively, at least through conversation, and ironically, we did not see kind of the same patterns between those two groups, and so the the um, the central factor assessments through transcranial magnetic stimulation kind of clarify what happened, but we still, if the two groups would have performed the same way, it wouldn't have mattered, you know? So it's finding that balance of what is really necessary in order to answer your question and what's feasible to apply in an applied environment. I know a long-winded answer there, so sorry for that one.
Did you look at serotonin at all?
Not in that study, no. So we the biomarkers that we had a range, but the biomarkers that we were mostly investigating was IGF-1, BDNF, because obviously we were interested in sort of the neural side. We had cortisol, testosterone. I'm trying to think what else. I think those were the main ones that we at least included in the publication. There were some others that then other people in the lab more thoroughly investigated when they looked into extracellular vesicles and an area that's kind of growing in research right now. But I wasn't one of the main or leading authors on that, and my expertise is certainly not as good in that area as it is with some of these others. So maybe you can invite them on a podcast soon and they can tell you more about it. Yeah.
That's good. Ted, can you wrap us up? Bring us home.
Sure. Felix, we always ask our guests to recommend to our listeners, some reading materials that you found to be beneficial and that could be on, your area of expertise or something unrelated to your area of expertise that you found useful.
Yeah. A book that I think it is very dense, so I will preface that, and it might not be for everybody, but it really, I'm trying to recall the author's name. A book that really kind of changed my thinking, especially when it comes to sports science, is called Statistical Rethinking. It's essentially about going away from our typical point of view of black and white hypothesis testing. Either we reject the hypothesis or we fail to. It's by Richard McElrath, and it's taking more of a Bayesian view on things. So acknowledging that with every decision we make, it's not black and white, but it's essentially on a continuum of uncertainty. So that, we might have multiple data sources that tell us that this athlete is fatigued, but you never really know the ground truth. That's just bottom line what it is, right? Instead, a better view to take is essentially to say on a continuum, to rather reject the hypothesis, to calculate the certainty associated with a certain outcome, that you are fatigued or not, right? So we go from binary to more a continuous perspective of an outcome. And I found that to be extremely valuable also in my communication with coaches, because we all probably have been in that situation one time where you say something, I believe this is happening, then it doesn't, and now you look like, you had an agenda or whatever. But I think reframing that, we can be pretty certain that this is the case, and maybe having the associated percentage of likelihood attached to that is extremely valuable, because then you are somewhat vulnerable and acknowledge that you don't have all the answers, right? And I found that kind of really goes a long way with coaches, that we need to acknowledge that there are limitations with this, but it is most likely the best way forward. So statistical rethinking is a really great read, but it's dense. I'll give you the heads up there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This hour has flown by. I know the way we always like to do things, we like to leave it open, because when it flies by this fast and the information is flowing, we have to do a part 2 or 3 and 4. So thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. And yeah, Dr. Reimer, close us out.
I just want to say thanks to Dr. Pat and Dr. Ted, and especially you, Felix. You never disappoint. I've listened to you present and talk, and I've interacted with you plenty of times. And thanks for coming on today. And I hope that the audience enjoys this episode as much as I did. So thanks, everyone, and try to stay warm. It's cold out there.
All right.
Yep.
Take care.
Appreciate you all. Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me, guys.
Bye-bye.